Happy 2023. I hope everyone had a great holiday celebration and is ready to start fresh in a brand new year. But before we turn the corner on 2022, I just wanted to take one moment and look at my best reads of that year. These books are in no specific order. I just looked through my Goodreads and picked out what I liked the most this year. Passing by Nell Larsen. It's a little bit outside of my usual reading genre, but I just really loved it. I found the writing to be so dainty and feminine, and I thought there were a lot of really great lines and excellent writing. The story was personally pretty new to me, and it surrounds this concept of identity and how society treats you based off of that identity. Specifically in this case, it's the tale of a Black young woman who was light-skinned enough that she decided to pass as white in the 1920s. She and one of her other friends meet up and they end up talking about their lives. It's interesting. It has a lot of different points and nuance and interesting elements to it that I think are applicable to liminal spaces and identity today. I never ended up talking about it too much except mentioning how much I liked it in my second quarter reads, mostly because even though I really enjoyed the book, I don't feel super comfortable describing or talking about certain elements of the book. It feels weird to talk about it and lead a discussion when I don't feel like I'm the best person to lead the discussion. I would say that I loved Passing. I think it's an excellent read, and I'm looking at Nell Larsen's catalog to see if I can pick something else out from her to read this year because I just really enjoyed her writing style. The overall flow of the prose and her descriptions and her characterizations were all just really good. Next on my list is going to be Bear by Marian Engel. It is literally the only book of note in my third quarter reads, which is why it has its own video here. I loved Bear. It's got this modern fairy tale kind of feel to it. It's not quite a fantasy, but it doesn't quite hit the literary fiction market either. Is living in this interesting space. Bear is a widely recognized story. It did win the Governor's Literary Award the year it was published, and it's for good reason. The writing is excellent. It's very rich and thematic. It's tackling a lot of different subject matter and can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. I know when I was reading it, not only was I enjoying the experience and really living in the moment, identifying with Lou, but I also was a little bit jealous of Marian Engel's writing talent too. I like to write a lot of different kinds of fictional things, and one of the things I have to do in my draft work is make it less busy because the book is about 9 million different things and has all these different themes. Consistent feedback I get is it's way too much and I need to parse it down and bring it to 2 or 3 things. And here Marian Engel is covering men and women's relationships and domestic violence, women in the workplace, humanity's interactions with the environment and returning to the wild, making the wild an ideal state versus living in a society, the less ideal state, and maybe falsely making nature sacred in a way that it shouldn't be considered by people. And it's also making some remarks about how Canada treats and views its indigenous population in the 70s. It's got this beautiful time capsule feel about the 70s and where women were viewed societally in that time period too. All that's really interesting and thematic, and we could talk about any one of those. We could also talk about humans' relationship to nature, how humanity treats wild animals, humanity's sometimes obsession with certain kind of wild animals, and our desire to tame, live with, coexist in some way with the wild. And all those elements are sort of tied together because some of the critique on Indigenous people and how they're spoken about and referred to ties back to the Indigenous people having a better relationship with the land or nature, or having some kind of mystic almost communication that's preferable to other people's interpretation. There isn't a comparison here about the Indigenous lifestyle and how they treated women versus standard Western society, but it was kind of notable to me that the one Indigenous person that we really met and talked with at any length within the book was this older lady who had raised children, and she seemed to come and go as she pleased. She seemed to be pretty happy, satisfied with her life in general, and also like settled where she was. There's Lou, and she is not happy in her life. There's nothing that seems to be going her way, career-wise, love life-wise. The whole thing seems to be kind of a mess. There's also some interesting comparisons I think you could make between the bear and Homer. Both of them are seen as like a potential romantic partner for Lou in this book. Homer is married, has a wife and child, and he's still like chasing after some side action with Lou. The bear is not at all interested in anything except existing. It's like very much an animal, and Lou is the one pursuing the relationship with the bear. It's one of those things you have to get over the fact that like part of the premise is this woman is cataloging the university's new house, and she ends up getting into a relationship with the pet bear. Like that's kind of a wild premise, but Mariana Engel makes it work. It like feels very fairy tale, very like sort of slipping into another world, like a fairy realm or something, where there's just like more possibilities or more things that are acceptable. And even how like Lou herself thinks about it when she's driving there, she's like leaving society behind and going out into the wild and like returning to nature and all that kind of stuff. And when she's preparing to leave, again, she's like putting that like bookish, mousy persona back on. She's reintegrating into what society expects from her. The two sides of that coin and how the book sort of like navigates that gray territory. Next is going to be The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. This is one of those classics that I listened to and mentioned in my first quarter reads. I think some of my favorite parts of this actually come before we get to the Island of Dr. Moreau, where our main character has been thrown to sea and is just desperately trying to survive in a lifeboat. Something about me that always loves that like man surviving in the wild kind of situation. I'm less in love with it once we get to the island. There is a lot of interesting thematic things happening, and there is some great like scary things and chilling elements about what's going on in the island. It just wasn't 100% for me. H.G. Wells has a really great timeless kind of science fiction writing style. I like him better in War of the Worlds, but that's not one I read this year. Next is going to be The Doctor of Dr. Moreau by Sylvia Moreno-Garcia. I just went over this one in my favorite reads of fourth quarter, so I won't belabor it too much. I liked this one a lot better than The Island of Dr. Moreau, all things considered. Dr. Moreau was actually pretty consistent across both of these versions, but I think it worked better when Dr. Moreau has more characters to play off of. So he's got like this British like warden guy who's kind of keeping all the animals in line. He's got a couple of hybrids that are up and acting intelligently. We get a lot more insight into the hybrid's life in this version. We have the daughter, of course, of Dr. Moreau, with something that I had pitched back in my review for Dr. Moreau, that we needed some kind of female presence. I had suggested a wife, but the daughter works well here too. The father-daughter relationship and a daughter trying to please her father. It asks interesting questions about like what we should do if someone we love is doing something wrong. Next is going to be The Backbone of the World by Stephen Graham Jones. This is book 3 in the Trespass collection. The Trespass collection as a whole was really great. I want to give an honorable mention to Stag by Karen Russell and The Tiger Came Down from the Mountain by Sylvia Moreno-Garcia. I just happen to like The Backbone of the World the most. I just felt like it took a premise I've listened to, read a lot, and twisted it and gave me a new way to look at it or think about it. And that's always like fun for me and something that's kind of special. Next is going to be The Parable of Sower and The Parable of Talents by Octavia E. Butler. I have a full review for The Parable of the Sower that you can check out here. But this is one of those books that had me thinking for a long time afterwards. In fact, sometimes we're driving around and I'm looking at the day and I'm thinking about things, and my mind like turns back over to The Parable of the Sower and the world that Octavia E. Butler had sort of developed for it. It's really interesting, partially because we are living through the years that The Parable of the Sower takes place after like major global warming and economic collapse here in the US. There are quite a few elements that are described in the book that you can see like some connection to things that we've recently lived through here. It's really interesting too because the cast is very diverse. All of Octavia E. Butler's casts have more diversity, which I think more accurately reflect the world that I'm seeing around me and is more fun for me to read about. Also, I think the parable of the sower and the parable of talents like pair perfectly well together. I was like a little unsatisfied at the end of Parable of the Sower. I felt like Lauren had gotten a little too right all the time. But looking at her as like a figurehead for a new religion and like gathering people together and becoming a leader and seeing that like reflected bitter taste through her daughter's eyes after she had passed was just like a really interesting way to do it. I thought Parable of Talents did really well incorporating Lauren's daughter's perspective, Lauren's perspective, her husband's perspective, Banco. And it made like the encouragement that Lauren had done for everyone to write journal entries suddenly become relevant. We got some more Earthseed verses. I think too, Parable of Talent interested me specifically because there has been like this critique between, I think it's second wave and third wave feminism. The daughters of some of the major movement people have come forward and discussed whether or not their mothers cared more about women in general and themselves than they did about caring for their child and making their child feel loved and at home. And we can sort of like see the same push and pull between Lauren and her daughter and how her daughter feels about her. This is made worse a little bit in Parable of Talents because Lauren was literally ripped from her daughter, and she spends the whole rest of her life, like all of her journal entries and stuff, even though she's trying to push Earthseed together and create family and all this other good, positive stuff. She's also desperately looking for her daughter and desperately wants her back. We can see how this like is too little too late, oftentimes from the daughter's perspective, or even like entirely meaningless based off of how she's writing and describing her mother after the fact. But at the same time, I thought like this was a great pull between specifically this historical issue, because on one hand, I'm sure these women who had been out there pushing for women's rights were thinking about their daughters and the future for their daughters and their ability to go out there and do things and feel safe and secure. And I'm sure they also felt torn about where they should be, how they should spend their time, what long term would be most important. And even though they were agonized and trying to balance these things, and of course I'm saying all of this in good faith and not mentioning any specifics, mostly because I don't want to argue about it one way or the other, the children were still like resentful or felt neglected or harmed in some way because they had pushed this other thing ahead of them. And I just really liked being able to like meditate on that and reflect on it in a fictional work. I think it's something most people can relate to because I feel like most of us have some kind of feeling about how we were raised and when we needed space or we needed attention and we didn't get it in the right way at the right time. Certainly Lauren's daughter's life was very traumatic. She needed a lot of intervention and she just didn't get it. But that's part of like the beauty of the Parable of the Sower and the Parable of Talents together as a story. And I just thought like the mother-daughter relationship was really strong, even though they didn't spend a lot of time together on page. And I was really invested in where Earthseed was going and what was going to happen to Lauren and all of her friends and family. Next is going to be Miao by Joyce Carol Oates. This is another one that I talked about in my best of fourth quarter reads. It's a very brief novella. It's from the Darker Corner collection. I didn't like Darker Corners as much as I like the Trespass collection. I like these shorter stories. They're quick, easy reads, and I think it gives you a chance to explore like a very self-contained idea. And Joyce Carol Oates does well, like giving us just this one specific moment in this girl's life, and it just paints like a very authentic and real feeling picture and brings in some of like the day-to-day horrors, but also like sort of heightens it with something that's probably outside of a lot of our readers' experience. And then the last book I wanted to mention here is Song for the End by Kit Power. I did just finish this one at the very end of the year, so it's sort of like sticking in my head. But this is a horror story that is about a band that created this song that's causing people to die. And there's a little bit more going on than that, but I don't want to tell too much of it. It ends up becoming a very interesting, like kind of personal story about how one bandmate interprets the song's success versus another bandmate. And it asks us like some interesting questions about whether the ends justify the means, or what it would take to make a better world or to make meaningful change. And like the story itself leaves you on an ambiguous note, like whether or not this song's existence is good or bad, or will end up doing good or bad things for humanity as a whole, is a really interesting idea to me. I don't know, I spent a lot of time going back and forth between being on the hero side and the villain side. It's not like your traditional horror, like it's not spooky, but there are like some chilling implications and some interesting questions about the nature of human nature. I definitely recommend it. And those are going to be my best reads for 2022. I've already got 2 books in on my 2023 reading, and I'm hopeful to tackle more soon. Overall, it was a great year, and I'm looking forward to a new 2023. Tell me in those comments down below about your favorite read for 2022 and what you're most looking forward to in 2023. And as always, keep reading. Bye!